The iron hinges of the great oak doors shrieked, a violent, metallic wail that seemed to tear the very air in two. It was the sound of a world being severed. Rain, cold and relentless, lashed against the coarse, unbleached wool of Brother Thomas's habit as he leaned his entire trembling weight against the heavy timber beam, sliding it into its iron brackets with a deafening, hollow thud. Beyond these towering walls, the valley lay drowning, not just in the biting autumn storm, but in the suffocating, weeping grip of the black sweat. For weeks, the distant, frantic tolling of village funeral bells had drifted over the masonry like a dying heartbeat. Tonight, for the first time, there was only the howling wind. Within the shadowed heart of the cloister, 20 men stood in absolute, breathless stillness. They were now entombed with their God and their terror. They had chosen the stark sanctuary of exile over the certainty of the lime-choked graves being clawed into the valley mud. The cavernous nave of the Abbey smelled faintly of desperation, a biting mixture of burning juniper branches scattered across the flagstones to ward off the foul miasma, and the lingering sweet rot of stale beeswax. Thomas pressed his palm flat against the unyielding oak of the gate. The wood was freezing, rough beneath his calloused skin. It was the final fragile barrier between holy breath and creeping pestilence. He closed his eyes. The hollow scrape of a wooden spoon against the bottom of a dry flour barrel is a lonely sound, echoing through the cavernous cellar like the final fading heartbeat of the Abbey itself. In the suffocating dimness of the undercroft, Brother Elias moves with the sluggishness of a man whose ghost has already begun to depart. The air here is thick with the scent of damp earth and the cloying, sickly sweetness of decaying apples, a perfume of rot that mocks their hunger. His fingers, cracked and swollen with purple chilblains from the subterranean chill, pick delicately at a sack of rye, trying to separate the edible grain from a creeping, pale bloom of mold. For a month they have survived on nothing but tooth-shattering hardtack and a watery cabbage broth that tastes of little more than hot rain and desperation. The silence of the Abbey is no longer a holy thing, it is a weight. High above his head, vibrating through the massive stone pillars, the chanting in the choir stalls has begun to falter. The robust baritones that once shook the rafters have been hollowed out by fasting, reduced to thin, reedy whispers that sound more like a plea for mercy than a song of praise. Every prayer is a heavy labor, every breath a transaction with a God who seems to have turned his face from their locked stone world. Elias listens to the skeletal rhythm of the liturgy, realizing that the spirit can only soar so high when the flesh is tethered to an empty stomach. In the shivering dark, Elias reaches into the folds of his habit and clutches a rusted iron key, its cold teeth biting deep into his palm. It is the key to the final hidden store of communion wine, the sacred blood of Christ. In this slowly freezing world, where the hearths are cold and the bellies are hollow, it represents the only warmth left to them. But to consume it now would be to admit that the end is not merely approaching, but already sitting at their table. He stares at the heavy door of the wine cellar, a silent guardian of their last hope, wondering if the spirit can truly survive when the oil in the lamp finally gutters out. A single drop of cold water plummeted from the vaulted heights of the scriptorium, striking the center of the vellum with the heavy finality of a gavel. The ink, fresh and dark as a bruised vein, bled outward in a jagged, weeping star. Brother Silas did not move to blot the moisture. He simply watched the blue-black pigment dissolve, a slow unraveling of a week's labor. In the years before the Great Dying, such a blemish would have been a crisis of craft, a smudge on the record of the divine. Now it was merely another ghost. The great silence of the Abbey, which once felt like a comforting blanket of shared devotion, had curdled into something predatory, an agonizing, breathless void that swallowed the scratch of the quill and the rustle of robes. The air in the scriptorium tasted of ancient dust and the sharp, acidic tang of dry leather. It was the smell of a history that had stopped growing. Through the narrow lancet window, the moon began its slow ascent, casting long skeletal shadows across the rows of empty desks where dozens of men once labored to bring light to the dark ages. Now the brothers had stopped their illumination. The gold leaf remained locked in its caskets, and the vibrant lapis lazuli sat uncrushed. They were paralyzed by the knowledge of the unseen, creeping death that waited just beyond the locked timber of the Abbey gates. To paint a saint seemed a hollow gesture when the world outside was being painted in the black soot of the plague. Silas stared at his quill, the white swan feather trembling in his skeletal grip. It felt impossibly heavy, a spear he was no longer strong enough to wield against the encroaching dark. He looked down into the ceramic inkwell, where the midnight liquid mirrored his own hollowed eyes. It was a bottomless pool of unspoken confessions and unwritten elegies, a dark water waiting to pull him under. He wondered, with a sudden sharp pang of dread, if there would be anyone left to read the words he was too afraid to write. For as the ink dried on the ruined page, a sound began to drift from the stone corridors, not the scratch of a pen, but the wet, unmistakable rattle of a breath that shouldn't be there. The faint, wet rattle of a cough broke the midnight stillness of the infirmary, a sound so small, yet it shattered the illusion of their sanctuary like a hammer through glass. It was the sound they had all prayed against, the one they had barred the great oak doors to avoid, yet here it was, a rhythmic, liquid struggle for air echoing off the cold, lime-washed walls. Father Abbot stood over the low cot of the youngest novice, his own breath coming in shallow, fearful hitches. He pressed a linen cloth, steeped in pungent vinegar and crushed thyme, tightly to his nose and mouth, a desperate barrier against the invisible miasma that now inhabited the very room where they had sought to heal. Beneath the thin light of a single tallow lamp, the boy's skin appeared mottled and bruised, slick with a fever sweat that carried the unmistakable, cloying scent of spoiled meat. It was the smell of the world they had abandoned. The pestilence had not needed to break down their doors or scale their battlements. It had slipped through their impenetrable stone like a shadow, riding perhaps upon the back of a flea, the hem of a habit, or the very wind that howled through the cloisters. In that moment, the abbot realized the terrifying truth of their seclusion. Their walls were not a shield, but a shroud. With hands that had blessed kings and broken holy bread, the abbot carefully draped a heavy woolen blanket over the boy's shivering frame, though he knew no amount of wool could warm a blood that was already turning to ash. A solitary beeswax candle flickered furiously in a sudden phantom draught, throwing tall, dancing specters against the mortared walls, shadows that looked like hooded reapers waiting for their turn. The locked doors had succeeded in keeping the dying world out, but in their frantic haste to survive, they had sealed the terror within. As the abbot stepped back into the darkness of the corridor, his shadow stretching long and thin, he looked toward the courtyard where the earth remained undisturbed. He knew then that the silence of the abbey was about to be broken by a sound far more permanent than a prayer. The ground was waiting, and the iron tools of the sexton were already beginning to stir in the shed. The iron spade struck the frozen earth with a sharp, ringing thud,
a sound so lonely and final it seemed to vanish instantly into the thick gray ribs of the morning fog. There was no bell to announce this departure, no gilded cross carried high by a weeping novice. There was only the vibration of metal against stone-cold clay, traveling up the wooden shaft and into Brother Malachi's aching arms. He leaned against the spade, his breath pluming in the frigid air like white smoke from a guttering candle. In the center of the enclosed courtyard, the garden that once breathed the fragrance of medicinal rue and sweet chamomile was now a landscape of scars. 3 shallow, jagged wounds had been cut into the dirt, their edges rimed with a delicate, mocking frost. Beside him, lying on the frost-killed grass, was a shape wrapped tightly in unbleached linen. It was bound at the neck, the waist, and the feet with rough hemp rope, the knots tied with a utilitarian haste that felt like a betrayal of the soul within. This was the new liturgy of the Abbey, a ritual of isolation. There were no swinging censers to cloud the air with incense, no rising tide of Gregorian chant to carry the spirit toward the light. The only music was the rhythmic, harsh scraping of the shovel, and the wind howling through the empty cloisters, a predatory sound that searched for a way into the lungs of the living. Malachi knelt by the side of the trench, his knees sinking into the churned mud. He scooped a handful of the bitter, dark soil, feeling the grit settle into the deep lines of his palms. As he let the dirt slip through his calloused fingers, it pattered against the white shroud with the sound of falling rain. He was burying a brother who, only a week ago, had shared his bread and his silence. But as the hole began to fill, the heavy, damp earth felt terribly prepared for Malachi's own weary bones. He looked up at the high gray walls of the Abbey, realizing that the stone was no longer keeping the world out, it was merely holding the dead in. The sun was beginning to rise, but for the first time in his life, Malachi feared the light would only reveal how many more graves he would have to dig before the thaw.
The steady, rhythmic drumming of meltwater against the flagstones was the first sound of a world reborn. It dripped from the snarling mouths of stone gargoyles, no longer frozen in ice, but weeping as the long, cruel winter finally began to recede. Brother Thomas stood in the center of the chapter house, his face a map of hollows and sharp angles, his wool habit hanging loose upon a frame that had forgotten the weight of a full meal. With hands that shook from more than just the lingering chill, he reached out and pushed open the heavy oak shutters. The sudden, violent brilliance of the spring sun was blinding, a golden intrusion that stung eyes grown accustomed to the sickly, dim flicker of tallow candles and the oppressive shadows of a year spent in hiding. He leaned against the stone sill, squinting at a horizon he had not seen in months. Beyond the high defensive walls of the Abbey, the valley lay in an eerie, profound stillness. There were no columns of smoke from village hearths, no lowing of cattle in the distant pastures, yet the air was different. The breeze no longer carried the cloying, heavy stench of the black sweat or the sulphurous tang of funeral pyres. Instead, it bore the sharp, cleansing scent of damp pine needles and wet, waking soil, a smell entirely absent of rot. It was a fragrance of beginning, though it rose from a landscape of endings. In the cool darkness behind him, the silence was heavy, but it was no longer absolute. He could hear the shallow breathing of the others. Only 7 men remained of the 20 who had first barred the doors. 7 ghosts in tattered robes, standing in the shadows of a world they no longer recognized. Thomas walked slowly toward the belfry tower, his footsteps echoing like a memory through the empty cloisters. He reached up and grasped the thick, rough hemp of the bell rope, the fibers biting into his calloused palms. With a heave born of both grief and a desperate, fragile hope, he pulled. A singular, resonant chime shattered the silence of their endless grieving exile. It was a sound that rippled across the valley like a stone dropped into a mirror-still pond, a signal to anyone left alive that the stone tomb was open. As the bronze vibration hummed through his very bones, Thomas looked toward the great gate, wondering if the world they were about to re-enter would be a kingdom of life or a silent monument to the dead.